2021 will be a critical year for all of us, a test of our determination to deal with COVID-19 and overcome political and economic uncertainties. The element of trust, though, among all other factors, becomes essential in international relations. Despite tensions in 2020, how will China and the U.S. rebuild trust, to a certain extent at least, in the coming year? For answers, I talked to Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, who offered his insights on ways to rebuild China-U.S. ties. Take a listen.
Big change in their cooperation.
For me, I think there are two parts.
At least the two sides still
That's a great achievement.
Bilateral relationship with
Professor Chen, recently you have been intensively talking about the building of trust under a lot of circumstances. Tell me more about exactly what you meant.
I think that in terms of international relations, the elements of trust would serve as a kind of oxygen. Without the trust, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to have a basic interaction, let alone the cooperation.
Do you feel suffocating already, right now?
I think that in terms of bilateral relationship with Washington, yes, we do have felt such kind of very painful atmosphere, very polluted political atmosphere in Washington.
So you talk about trust, but is trust a basic element of international relations? Some argue it is real national interests that are the deciding factor.
Well, you see, the world has changed greatly. We are still living in an increasingly interdependent and complex same system. This is the reality. And both the United States and China, they are the key anchors against those systematic risks or challenges or dangers, from the climate change to those pandemics, those extremism, terrorism, etc., as well as those disasters, catastrophic phenomena affecting the stability and the prosperity of the world. So these are the reality. And if both sides could not appreciate the strategic value of sides' special role playing in this world, I think that this is the basic elements of the trust.
Can China and U.S. still trust each other?
We are still in the process of rebuilding the trust. I would say we are in the process of rebuilding the rationale of bilateral relationship, that both sides should recognize that if both sides could not accept this strategic value of working together to help prevent those catastrophic, systematic risks of the world we are living in, then I think that will be a loss for all, for both. So this is the reality, and this is also the fundamental changing context in which we have to reconsider the value of the trust. And I think even if we are in the process of rebuilding the trust, it is still some of basic elements of trust between two sides. Economically speaking, I think that despite of so many harsh pressure from Washington in the past few years, our economic relationships are still there. In terms of those science, technology area, even if I think that we are faced an increasingly decoupling approach pursued by Washington. But I think that if you just check those cooperation in responding to the pandemic, the scientists, the doctors of both sides, they're also working quite closely, actually. So I think that those kind of a working relationship based upon trust are still there. Otherwise, I think there will be no possibility of working together at all.
Will a change of administration make a huge difference?
Well, I think Biden administration will be much more pragmatic in terms of dealing with China. Biden administration recognize both sides are quite different. But so far, those key players, senior officials appointed by the president-elect of Biden, they try to rule out prospect of a Cold War with China. That's quite promising, actually, because this is what Beijing wants. We don't see that both sides actually are engaged in a kind of a Cold War scenario. And we also believe that despite of the differences, politically, ideologically, but the common, as I said, those common challenges facing us, their importance are much bigger than those of the differences in terms of those ideology. This is what I understand. So this is the reason why I believe that there are still some elements of the trust, and the Biden administration, as long as they can pursue those pragmatic approach to China, it is more likely that both sides can meet in between and rebuild those shared rationale or framework.
You talk about the shared rationale or shared framework, and shared probably narrative in a way. How much do you think efforts needs to be made from both sides, particularly at the very beginning of the change of administration? Now, there seems to be a phenomenon after talking to both sides through my program, that one side is always expect the other side to take the first few steps.
Well, there's a mindset. I agree with your observation. There's a mindset, there's a rhetoric in Washington, D.C. these days, arguing that now the ball is in Beijing's court, and it is Beijing rather than Washington, D.C. to take some initiative, and arguing that actually nowadays the Biden administration has been constrained by many of the legacies of Trump administration, and also it argued that Biden administration are going to continue some of the tough policy against China, to use those tough policy as a leverage to shape or press Beijing to behave itself. So this kind of a rhetoric has reinforced a kind of perception in Washington, D.C. that now the ball is on Beijing's side. If we look
Well,
back...
Beijing also think that the ball is in the court of Washington's side.
No, I think that Beijing are much more proactive.
Meaning?
Beijing believes that the ball is in the middle. Both sides should step up, should meet in the halfway. While on one side, I think that the incoming Biden administration, during this very sensitive transitional period, to keep some degree of caution is understandable. But domestic agenda should not be an excuse for preventing them to take a more proactive policy to engage with China. So I think that Beijing has made quite clearly that we are ready, and we are going to reactivate all kind of dialogues. And we also, I think, our senior officials have already offered a different kind of a to-do list. So whether Biden administration would be ready and be more proactive to engage with Beijing, that's very important. So I think that the ball is in the middle.
The ball is in the middle. The to-do list that you said that the Chinese sides are offering, climate change, pandemic cooperation, economic recovery, these are said by the Chinese State Councilor Wang Yi. So are these the basic points that China is proposing?
Yes, I think that that's a very important initiative. As I said, that these days, both sides should recognize or reassure each other's strategic value of cooperation. And those areas for cooperations all related to a systematic stability and prosperity. So whether both sides can work together, for instance, in terms of a vaccine production, distribution, to make the vaccine really a public good, not only to both countries, to peoples of both countries, but rather to those most vulnerable peoples around the world. Because the pandemic, the nature of pandemic means that if those most vulnerable parts could not be accessible to those vaccines, there will be no possibility to control the pandemic. So I think that this is
No one
the
is
responsibility.
safe until everyone is
Everyone is
safe.
safe.
Yeah.
So I think this is the key responsibility by the two stakeholders or anchors, as I said, those anchors are against the systematic risks.
Professor Chen, in China, there's a lot of debate about what to do next regarding China-U.S. relations, regarding where China is going, what is China's agenda, what should be the nature of the goal of China's development. Of course, there's an official narrative, but from the academic perspective, what do you make of, these decisions and others' perceptions about these decisions?
Well, I think that the pandemic has accelerated a lot of the pace, the tension, or the dynamic of the international relation. But it has not reversed or changed the fundamental course. Now, we have seen that on one side, we are all the beneficiary to some extent of this economic globalization. But on the other side, in terms of global governance system itself, I think that it is less capable of handling many of those shortcomings or weakness or the side effects of this economic integration or globalization. So I think that nowadays it's time for all those key players to really work together, to talk in a constructive but in a frank way, to share their compare notes about what is the real risk. Whether the real risk looming at large is the so-called ideological confrontation between the Beijing and Washington, or so-called China and those established powers. I think that we should rethink about our logic. And so this is the reason why, as in academic circle, it is very important to talk with our counterparts, particularly in the Western countries, to reconsider the so-called the narrative, because it helps shape the mindset, and also it helps shape the discourse as well as the agenda of the policy making.
Professor Chen, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.